Jamie Brenner grew up in suburban Philadelphia on a steady diet of Jackie Collins and Judith Krantz novels. She studied literature at the George Washington University before moving to New York City to work at HarperCollins Publishers, then later BarnesandNoble.com and Vogue.com before becoming an author. Her novel, The Forever Summer, is a national bestseller. Booklist declared her latest novel, Blush, a delectable soap that is the epitome of escapist reading pleasure. Her new book, Guilt, will publish on June 21st, 2022 with Putnam. Jamie divides her time between Philadelphia and New York City. And Brooke Lea Foster is an award-winning journalist whose articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post Magazine, The Atlantic, the Boston Globe Sunday Magazine, and HuffPost, among others. An alumna of the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College, she is the author of 3 nonfiction books and the novels Summer Darlings and On Gin Lane. And I'm now going to pass things over to them to get things started for us.
Brooke, happy pub day. It's
Thank
such an
you.
look at this beautiful. I'm still marveling over it because I just got my copy today. So for everyone out there, this is such a beautiful book to have. If there's ever a book that you need a physical book, this is it. So tell us a little about the book. What is On Gin Lane about?
So On Gin Lane is about a young debutante from Manhattan who is newly engaged to an auto magnate's son. And he seems like he's the cat's meow. He whisks her off to the Hamptons, to Southampton for the weekend. And he gifts her an early wedding present, a beachfront hotel. Hello, amazing. And she's sort of ambivalent about him gifting her this hotel. She doesn't necessarily want to spend the summer there. He kind of announces they're going to spend the summer there, and she wasn't certain she wanted to be there, for that long. But she's at the beach and her friends are there, and she's like, okay, she starts to come around. And the grand opening party for the hotel happens within, a couple days. And that night when they go to sleep, the hotel actually burns to the ground. And the story is really about the unraveling of this relationship that she has with her fiancé. But more than that, it's a walk back in time into the 1950s Hamptons. It's a dazzling time to kind of go back to. It was great fun to research. And it's really, truly about a woman finding her place in the world, finding her voice, connecting with another woman who's a photographer who really takes her under her wing. But ultimately the part I'm most proud of is that it's a woman really connecting with her inner artist and self and finding her way.
Yeah, I know a lot of readers first met you through your debut novel, which was Summer Darlings, that came out in 2020. A great summer to have a book come out, as we all remember. In what ways is On Gin Lane similar, and in what ways is it different from Summer Darlings?
That's a great question. Summer Darlings takes place in Martha's Vineyard, which is another beach island that I love. And it takes place 5 years later. So those are some really obvious differences. But it's interesting because Summer Darlings follows a nanny. So she's really a have-not. She doesn't have a father. She has a single mom. She finds out that she lost her scholarship to go to college, and she arrives on Martha's Vineyard to nanny for a wealthy family. And so she kind of peels back this curtain and gets a real sense of what the rich really live like, rich people behaving badly, I would say. Everly, on the other hand, who's the main heroine of On Gin Lane, she comes from a very wealthy family. She's raised at the Plaza Hotel. She had this really glamorous, coming out. She's always going to luncheons where she's wearing frilly dresses. She's been forced into this life by her, just by way of being born into it. And she goes out to the Hamptons and then kind of realizes that especially when the hotel burns to the ground, and then she loses a lot of her financial support from her family, she kind of realizes what it's like to live without. So I think in a way it's really interesting because the first one is kind of a have not and the other one is a have, and kind of making sense. They're both making sense of their place in the world. So they're similar, but different.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, On Gin Lane is set in the Hamptons, and we've both set books in the Hamptons. It's a very alluring place to write a novel. Why did the Hamptons draw you to set your book here? And why do beach towns in general make for such interesting book settings?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up out on Eastern Long Island. So, I grew up about 30 minutes away from Southampton in Wading River, Shoreham Wading River. And, when I was a kid, we would pile into the car and we would go out to Montauk to see my family who lives out there. Some of them are summer residents and some of them live out there year round. And it's just, you would get to this spot in the Hamptons, and you all, if you're local, know exactly the spot I'm talking about as you're approaching East Hampton, where the elm trees just graciously, reach over the street, and you come down to the ponds in East Hampton and you make the left onto the main drag there and you start coming into town. And it just always felt like such a magical place to me. The buildings go back in time, are historic. You've got the library, you have the old East Hampton Star newspaper, with still the gold writing in the window. And as I got older and, still did that drive through and looked at those tight hedgerows that hide all these beautiful, tidy houses with perfect shutters and beautiful driveways even, right? Like the driveways are gorgeous with crushed shells and pebbles and everything, I just started to wonder, the journalist in me, the one that asks questions like, who lives here and who gets to play here and who, what really goes on behind these doors? Who are these people and what are their struggles? And it's just always captivated me as a place. And I think beach towns in general, I don't know about you, I'm curious what you would say, but for me, beach towns capture my imagination because they really are a place of people who have so much and people who are serving the people who have so much, right? It's like the service workers, and then it's also the wealthy who come to play. And I think that tension between those two types of people are really fascinating and make for great stories. So both of my books really have people from both sides of the fence, from all walks of life, because it really helps to get into the nitty gritty of a town when you start to see how people live differently in the same place. What about you?
You just totally hit the nail on the head for me. That's exactly why I set my novel Drawing Home in Sag Harbor, because you have this, really, first of all, great history, as you mentioned, the Whaling Museum, and there's like the town museum. And then you have the people who live there year round, who work in the restaurants, who run the hotels. And then you have the summer population. And like you, I was fascinated by the symbiotic relationship between the two, the tension between the two, and sort of the really interesting scenarios you can create as an author when you throw them together in unexpected ways. So I completely feel the same way about why the Hamptons is an interesting setting. And
I also feel like, too, just to add something, like, I feel like the Hamptons is similar to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and all these places we love in New England, which is that they look so perfect, right? Like they look so amazing on the outside, but everybody just puts their pants on the same way. Everybody's struggling with heartbreak and everybody's dealing with, overcoming obstacles in their life and pain and friendship and feeling close to someone in their life or not. And I just think it's so interesting to kind of dive into their world and show that we're all really just the same. We just have different backdrops to our lives.
Exactly. Some family dramas just play out in bigger houses.
Yes, exactly.
More room to argue in. Absolutely. So aside from studying, what draws you to historical stories?
Oh my goodness. So I love writing historical fiction because I love doing the deep dive into the research, right? I mean, if you're going to talk about what people were pulling aspirin from in the 1950s, it better be a glass bottle. You just have to do so much research to get every little detail right. And the reporter in me loves going back in time and finding out. I talked to so many local historians out there, and also just in the Hamptons, and also people who just grew up out there and who had so many interesting things to tell me. I mean, writing historical fiction in general brings you back to a time when culturally things were different. I mean, in the 1950s, women lived an entirely different existence. Maybe they had similar struggles and pain, but the pressures put on women were entirely different. And I have to know exactly what my character would have done when she was out there, and what she would have, been reading, what she would be wearing. She better be at least trying a Jello with, a Jello mold with salmon in it, all these wacky things that they did back in the 1950s, and, is super interesting. The music, I've listened to the music. So I love kind of transporting myself back in that time.
Do you ever find something in your research that's a detail you just love, but it's just awkward or doesn't work to try to like shoehorn it into your story? Or do you find a way to use mostly everything?
I mean, I tried to use as much as I could, but there was one piece of information that I was never able to get in, and I was trying so hard to attach it to a character, and it just became this like drawn out thing that didn't work. But when I was interviewing, I think it was Dan Ratner of Dan's Papers, he was telling me how down in Southampton, where the famous Bathing Core Beach Club is, there was a long time where the people there would only let other people, only people from the wealthy summer colony could get in there, back in the 1950s and 60s. Now, whatever goes on today, I can't speak about. I can only speak about what went on back then, but they couldn't get in. And so the local professional class in Southampton wanted a beach club. They wanted to be able to get in there. And they always kept getting rejected because they weren't part of that city crew, the Palm Beach and the winter crowd. So they ended up starting their own tennis club. So like the Southampton Tennis, and I think it's the Beach and Tennis Club, or I'm probably getting it a little off, but it's right down the road on Gin Lane. That was by the professional class of the locals who couldn't get in, and they were just tired of it. So I wanted to have one of my characters be like trying to start that, it's just like a fun little tidbit, but it just didn't work. So I had to let go of that one, but I did include so many other things about the Hamptons in that time.
I'm just curious, did you read the book Philistines at the Hedgerow by Stephen Gaines?
No, should I have?
Yeah, not that you should have, but I think you'll appreciate it because he takes you behind a lot of these, like you mentioned the hedgerow and you wonder what's behind it. And I think we all do. And I love books that imagine, but that's one that happens to be nonfiction.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like if you, I don't know, like the thing about historical fiction is that not only are you figuring out what people were, thinking about reading, doing at that time, but when you're setting in a place like the Hamptons, you have to know what it was like back then there. So there was just it made me think of it because I was talking about that beach club, but there was just so many cool things I learned. Like, for example, how many of us have sat in that Route 27 East traffic going through all the towns? Well, when you were getting to Bridgehampton, there were so few houses and tree cover that multiple people told me you could see the water from there. And that's so hard to believe that you just saw potato farms for as far as the eye could see. And then you would see the water. I mean, that's amazing. People were telling me that, you could go into Bobby Van's, which is still there in Bridgehampton, and see Truman Capote at the bar. I mean, there's like so many cool things. And then down in on Gin Lane, actually, it's not Gin Lane, it's Meadow Lane. Meadow Lane, kind of, if you come down Halsey Neck Road, I'm getting in the weeds here, but if you go basically right away from Cooper's Beach down in Southampton, that's Meadow Lane. And the far end parts of that, I was told, used to have 0 houses. Now there's the most ginormous, like multi-chimney, huge, sprawling, beautiful cedar shingled, most of them mansions. But back then it was just nature. It was just wide open bay and ocean and land. And to me, that's really fun to imagine, to, go back in time there. Oh, and one more thing, I could go on about the historical part out in the Hamptons because it's so cool, but there used to be, I swear to you, car racing in the streets of the Hamptons. They would go through all the little towns. It was a real race, true race car drivers. And they would literally race the potato fields and go through the towns. And there were people clapping on the sidelines and waving flags. And at some point, they had to put a stop to it because there was a tragedy. And then they built a car racing track over near Sag Harbor. And it's now a golf course. But back then, it was car racing. Paul Newman raced there. How can anyone even imagine? It's such a cool thought to me.
No, I mean, it's a fascinating era. It's a fascinating place. So how did you decide what story you wanted to tell with those other pieces in place?
Okay, so hold on. I want to adjust I feel like I'm getting like too much sun. It's like I love the sun at all times. I'm even doing it on Zoom. I'm getting my sun. Okay, so let me move over here. So when I was doing research for Summer Darlings, I came across the coolest little nugget. I was researching where a young woman would stay if she traveled to Chicago back in the 60s as a socialite. And it turned out that she would stay at the Palmer House Hotel in the Chicago Loop. But then, of course, when you're doing research, you fall down the rabbit hole, right? And I immediately started reading about this cool history of the Palmer House Hotel. And it turns out that this hotel was owned by a wealthy Chicago businessman named Potter Palmer. Sorry, it's a mouthful, so I always have to like focus on that. Potter Palmer. And he had a wife who's a beautiful young socialite. And he gifted her this hotel back in like the 1870s or 60s. I have to get the exact year. And 13 days later, it burned to the ground. So I had read that really briefly, and it immediately lodged in my mind because I thought, holy smokes, that's a great plot, right? Like you have this like glamorous couple. He gifts her a hotel. Like I said earlier, who gifts anyone a hotel? Just that in itself got me. I thought that was so cool. And then the fact that it burned to the ground and they spent the next several years just trying to rebuild it and raise money to rebuild it. And I started imagining, I have no idea what went on in their marriage or relationship, but I just started imagining the tension between them and how hard that would be and how you went from being kind of on top of the world to having this hotel burned down. So then I just decided to take that nugget and set it in the Hamptons because it would just seem like the most obvious place to have this young socialite from the city who meets this auto magnate son, and they go out to it's like you can see exactly how I started connecting the dots. And it's funny because we all get our ideas from such interesting places, right? I'd be very curious to hear where you get yours, Jamie, because I know as a journalist, I'm so used to finding story ideas. Like that's how I made a living for 20 years was finding story ideas. And I would find them in the most surprising of places. I remember finding one of my ideas in a classified ad, believe it or not, like back when there were classified ads in the back of Washington City paper in DC where I was living. I saw an ad for, Russian adoptees getting adopted, coming over and being like tried out in families. And it was just that ad. And suddenly I had a story. And Summer Darlings was an ad that I saw. The idea for Summer Darlings was an ad I saw in a magazine while traveling on the vineyard. And it was about how you could rent this house in the vineyard that was called The Swindle. And there was like 2 mansions on either side. And all of a sudden I just started envisioning the characters and who lived there and why they were there. And, so it's interesting. Where do you get your ideas for your latest book? Where did that idea come from?
So my latest, Guilt, which is coming out on the 21st, it's about a jewelry dynasty, kind of like, Cartier or Tiffany. But I thought of it because I was in Sag Harbor and I went to the store called Matriarch, which only has clothes and jewelry by female designers. And she had these necklaces, actually I'm wearing one now, by this jewelry designer named Lulu Frost.
Ooh.
And one of the things she had were all these letters and numbers, so charms. You could put your initials or your birth date, hook them right onto here. What Lulu Frost did is when the Plaza Hotel was sold and dismantled, she got all the fixtures from the doors, the letters, the numbers, and she turned them into necklace and bracelet charms. And I thought that was so interesting because it was making jewelry like personal, but also reflective of like a very specific moment in New York history.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of the contrast between jewelry that's meaningful and jewelry that's just very financially valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And why we buy things and why we use them for milestones and like real emotion versus fake values. So that was like just this rabbit hole I went down, and that's what started me thinking about jewelry as symbolic of our memories and family stuff. So that was the beginning of Guilt.
Oh my God, I love that. I really do, because I feel like with me, this sun is driving me crazy. Hold on, I really gotta move. I feel like with me and jewelry, I always am drawn more to jewelry that means something to me more than anything expensive. So I love that. And I always love when something has like jewelry has a story behind it. Like when I was writing Summer Darlings, I remember going to the Brooklyn Flea and just looking at all the vintage jewelry and buying things that I thought my characters would wear and then just keeping them near me. I never even wore a lot of it. I just thought it was so neat to put meaning behind, those pieces. That's really cool.
Definitely. So going back to Ungen Lane, one thing I want to speak about before we run out of time for questions. Oh, a reminder, everyone, if you would like a chance to win a signed free copy of Ungen Lane, just enter a question to be read during our Q&A, and you'll be automatically entered in the giveaway to win it. So you include real people in this novel. Arthur Miller makes an appearance, Marilyn Monroe, gossip columnist Igor Cassini. Why did you decide to use real people? And what are the sort of inherent complications when you choose to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I wanted to use real people because I wanted to really root people in that time, in that era. And I feel like I think it's even in chapter 2, the minute you go to the grand opening party for this hotel and you know that Jackie Kennedy's there and you know that CZ Guest, the famous, socialite from Manhattan, is there, and you know Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe show up, you know exactly where you are in time. So I felt like it was great fun. And with the Hamptons, it seemed silly not to do it. I mean, there's just so many great characters there. And in that time period to work with, like I wanted to have Jackson Pollock show up so bad, or Willem de Kooning, but it's like I couldn't figure out how to do it. But when it comes to Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller, like I said earlier, they were so famously, out there that summer, and it just. I love the idea of taking everyone's image of Marilyn Monroe as being the blonde bimbo who really, had no control over who she was and what she was doing, and she was a victim, and really turning that because, her story is a little more complicated than that. And I don't have any real close relationship with her, but because they were there, I like this idea that this very literary, Art Miller would be at this party, and then Marilyn Monroe would say something to my character that would change the trajectory of her summer, because that's what happens in summer, right? We have these run-ins with people that, change the way we're thinking or the way we're feeling, and we, suddenly we're off exploring. And that's kind of what Marilyn Monroe does for, and Art Miller does for my character when she meets them. But I think that, I don't know, I feel like as a writer, you really want to, the risk is that I didn't want to do anything where it felt like Marilyn Monroe would never say that, or Art Miller would never say that. The risk is that you could fail utterly and people read the scene and think, no way, this is a joke, right? Like she would never, ever say that. So again, you have to do your research. What was she like then? What maybe would he have said? What wouldn't he have said? You kind of have to dive in a little bit deeper to know how to portray them. But that's just them. There were a lot of other real people I used in the book. For example, there was a famous restaurant in Southampton called Bowden Square. And the owner, Herb McCarthy, was beloved in that area, in all of the Hamptons at that time. People would go to dinner there. He was a former Brooklyn law grad. He opened this restaurant and he always delivered a joke, and people, would go there on a Friday night. I heard it from so many different people I interviewed. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be great fun to put him in the book? He's passed away now. So, but there was a really great New York Times article about him. And, all of these first person accounts of him, delivering a steak and a smile, things like that you would hear. And it just seemed fun that people who were there in that time could revisit some of these memories in the book too. Keen's Books was the bookstore in Southampton at the time. And of course, my character stands in front of it looking at the latest novels out that summer. She's got to be at Keen's. It can't be a different bookstore. So I think it's fun to use real people because, especially when you have a place like the Hamptons with so many interesting people there. One time when I was at a party in Bridgehampton, I was just showing up there with a friend, and Betty Friedan was there. The woman who wrote the author of The Feminine Mystique. She's just at the party sipping a cocktail, and I got to meet her. And it's like that's the magical moments of sometimes being in the Hamptons. You just kind of run across people you don't expect at a dinner party.
Interesting. Well, aside from the real life characters in the book, I love the character names that you made up, especially Everly. How did you choose that name for your heroine, and how do you choose character names in general?
Okay, so Everly, I knew that her mom was going to be a Southern belle who married a Northerner and kind of got stolen from the South. I just had this vision that she was going to be a Southerner. So I knew that it had to be a name. You know, they often say that when you're choosing your characters' names, you have to think about the parents as much as you would, you know, the character themselves. So I knew the mother would want some, like, you know, very Southern sounding, gracious belle name. And when I was writing the story, I nicknamed her Evie because I was really drawn to that name at the time. And Natalie Jenner, who recently came out with her second book, Bloomsbury Girls, and we were swapping manuscripts to read it. And her first book and even her second book, the character's name is Evie. So as soon as I started reading her book, I started laughing because I'm like, oh my God, I loved your book so much. I actually stole the name of the character. So then we were laughing, Natalie and I, and she was like, you know what? Why don't you use the name Lee as a nickname, Lee? Because it's such a strong name and it really symbolizes kind of how she comes to stand on her own. And I just love that because I thought, here we are with this very like frou-frou name that symbolizes this old life of hers. But as she starts to become and really figure out who she is, and she starts cooking, which becomes this whole symbol of her, you know, in the beginning, she has no idea how to cook. She's been cooked for her whole life. She's had servants, and suddenly she's there trying to make like a peanut butter sandwich or a quiche or whatever. And as the summer goes on, she gets there and she begins cooking. And the idea that Lee could be the name that really symbolized her growth really appealed to me. So I was like, Natalie, thank you. That was great. But as the love interest, it's interesting. Her fiance, Roland, God, I wish I could remember what I originally had, but he had a different name in the early parts of in the early phases of the book. And her love interest, Curtis, also had a different name. And my editor, one of her pieces of feedback was, you know what, these names feel a little like Instagram kid names. And I'm like, you know what, you're kind of right, you know, because that's like our world. I'm around moms all the time. I'm around Ethans and I'm around, you know, all these names that are popular right now. Right. So I had to really think about what would be a name that they would have been named in the 30s, right? Or the 40s, you know, like what were the names then? And I loved Roland as soon as I found it, because I loved the idea that he would be nicknamed Raleigh, you know, Rolly, that was a popular name back then. He's an auto magnate's son. He's like the failed son, but he's an auto magnate's son. So he would be given that kind of name. So I knew that I had to pick a more like austere name for him. And Curtis, just, I wanted him to be so down to earth and such like the local doctor, you know, guy. And Curtis felt so accessible. But it's funny because Curtis to me was not a sexy name. I had to really push myself to fall for it. But I knew I didn't want a Melvin. You know, there were certain names I was just like, I can't do it. I won't do it. But in the end, it's funny. Now I love the name Curtis for him because he's just like, I wrote him into that character. Right. But I feel like with my characters, I'd be so curious, Jamie, to hear about you because, you know, with my characters, I start out knowing generally who they are, but I really discover a lot in the writing. And there's times where they just kind of, you're writing and you know you're developing them, but then there's the moment where they really show up for you and you're like, oh, hi, Everly. Thank you. You're here. I feel like I'd be curious to hear how that is for you.
Yes, there's definitely been, you know, I've changed names just because like after a while you realize it doesn't fit. And I always think how stressful it would be because like, look, we take the same shot in the dark when we name our children. So, and we just have to live with it. But luckily as authors, if it's not fitting the person, we can change halfway through. Yeah. So I've had some search and replace all moments in my manuscript for sure.
Yeah. It's so funny. And what about your characters? How do they come to you?
The names, you mean?
No, as are drawn. Like, are they fully drawn when you start writing, or do you discover them the way I was kind of describing?
The same way you describe, and it's like sometimes I even feel like I know, and then I can do a whole draft, and it takes that long for me to really even understand who this person is. And it's just funny. Every time I write a book, I forget how much you need to sort of let go and let things reveal themselves and not think you can plan every last minute detail down, you know,
Yeah.
from the minute you sit down in front of the computer, which I think as people, like maybe as a reporter, that was probably a learning curve for you. And it definitely was for me. I'm wondering if we should have time now for questions, Q&A.
Yeah, it looks like we have a bunch.
Okay.
Oh, Victoria, we can't hear you.
Sorry. All right, so we do have a lot of audience questions, and I just want to clarify that even if we don't get to your question, that does still mean that you are entered for the raffle. Hopefully we can get to as many as we can, so let's jump right in. So Brooke, what inspired you to become a writer?
Oh my goodness, that's a good one. I mean, I've been writing in journals since I was a little girl. My mom can tell you. You know, when I graduated from college, I really thought I wanted to be a lawyer, which is laughable now when I think about it. But it was the easiest way to do something that I thought was, quote, successful, right? So I worked at a law firm one summer, but I was an English major, so I loved books. I loved going to bookstores. I spend my life in bookstores. You can ask my kids because they spend their days there with me. I've always dreamed of writing fiction. But when I was 22 and just out of school, I said, you know what, I'll start in journalism because I love to write. So I ended up getting a job at Washingtonian Magazine in DC, which was amazing because it was long form magazine journalism. So I didn't do the typical articles you see today that are kind of like 800 words typically, and they go up online and they're quick reads. I did like 6,000 word articles where I would spend 2 months with a subject and really kind of dive in deep. And I think that kind of work actually prepared me for writing novels quite a bit because there's a narrative arc in nonfiction journalism. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. You know, you go through so many revisions, just like fiction. You know, Jamie can tell you, I'm sure she's much faster than me, but I mean, we revise. Our draft comes out, and I don't know about Jamie, but mine are messy and they need a lot of work. And that's the fun part for me. I love doing that part of the work. But journalism is really where I found my voice as a writer for many years. And it wasn't that I didn't have a story to tell in fiction. I don't know if nothing really stuck. So I would go into bookstores, or I would be on vacation daydreaming, or I'd be at the beach in the summer, and I would have a million ideas. I would have a character here or there, but I wouldn't have a complication. I didn't have a true story. And it wasn't until Summer Darlings that summer, when, believe it or not, my daughter was a baby. I don't even know how that was the moment I decided to have a idea in fiction that stuck, but it did. And that was how I became a fiction writer. And I love the pivot because I really I love escaping into my imagination. Imaginary friends are so much fun.
And Jamie, what about you? What inspired you to be a writer?
Oh my goodness, reading all the trashy novels of the 1980s when I was growing up. It was like the only interesting part of my life. So Jackie Collins, Judith Krantz, Sidney Sheldon, like what they gave to me in terms of escapism, showing me another part of the world. I just wanted to be able to do that. I didn't think it was remotely possible, but from the time I was little, I knew I wanted to write books.
How beautiful.
Yeah.
All right, next question. Can you please tell us a little bit about your research process for this book?
Okay, I kind of touched it already, but so I'll make it brief. But like I said earlier, I interviewed a lot of local historians. There, you know, at every library in the Hamptons, there's usually an archivist or someone who helped me out. I also interviewed a lot of locals who grew up there back then. But the thing I didn't mention earlier that I really enjoyed is that the East Hampton Star has the most amazing archive of past articles. And you can put in any address, you can put in names, you can put in charity balls. I mean, you can find articles that were written back in that time, and they're a riot to read, to be honest with you. I mean, there was one that was about too many people in a rooming house. It's like all this stuff you would see today about Airbnb, too many people in a rooming house and how they had to pass a law to, stop it. But also there was a hotel. This is super interesting in Southampton. Was it called the Irving? But it was a big wooden hotel, wood constructed hotel. And the reason I say that is because those are the ones that always burn to the ground. That's how, the hotel in my book burns to the ground. But it was a really popular hotel and it burned down and got lost and they never rebuilt it there.
Okay. So our next question, I'm curious why Brooke chose this time period for her book, and would you think about writing in a different time period?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I love the 1950s and the 1960s, or maybe I didn't say that, but the time period is so glamorous. I mean, it's really interesting because two things are at work at this time, right? Women in those days were told to get a Mrs. degree. They were told to be the happy homemaker. There was so much pressure for them to, go to college only to go back to the house with their husband and raise kids. But Everly, she's one of these people where, maybe that wouldn't necessarily have made her happy. Women back then relied on this mother's little helper pill, which was pretty much an antidepressant to get up in the morning. Women were very unhappy, as Betty Friedan's book, as I mentioned earlier, recounted. So yeah, I lost my way. What was the second part of the question?
Would you write in a different time period?
Right. So yeah. So anyway, I love this fashion. I love the music. All that stuff is just, it captures my imagination. That's why Summer Darlings takes place only 5 years later. But my third book actually does move up in time. It's like I'm going through the decades here. But the next book takes place in 1967 and 1977. It's kind of two different timelines, and it's about two friends. And it actually is also based out there in East Hampton, Amagansett area. But it's great fun to move into this time period. This is the time my parents were out in Montauk and they met, and they've told me all these stories, and my aunts and uncles have regaled me with, the Rolling Stones out there. And it's just so fun to be in that time period now. So yes, I am switching time periods a little bit. But I really have my heart at mid-century. I love the people in that time.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we have a lot of questions asking about your research. So this one is, what surprised you most in your research, and did anything stand out that you might use for another book in the future?
Oh, that's interesting. One of the things that I thought was really funny is that there was the dress code in Southampton in the 1950s. So if you couldn't wear a bathing suit in town, you could get a ticket. You had to have a cover up on that covered your entire, shebang. And then if you were wearing any shorts that were too short, you would get a ticket. There was this one woman I interviewed who had the best story about her mom, who went into Southampton to go pick up a, grocery delivery in the back of a shop. And in the front of a shop. And she got out in her little hot pants and shirt just to run in to get it. And the cop came up to her and he said, you got to go put some clothes on or I'm going to give you a ticket. So I mean, that surprised me, right? I didn't realize it was quite, quite like that. Another piece that surprised me was people telling me that when you would leave Amagansett and drive the Amagansett stretch out to Montauk, that area was all billboards. It was like billboards, talking about fishing and going to the clam bars. And Montauk really was just a few clam bars once you got out there. That was fun, and I have my characters, Starling, who's the photographer who kind of takes my main character, Everly, under her wing. She takes her out there when she feels like Everly is stressed and needs to chill out. And they drive out to Montauk and they kind of drive that stretch. And that was really inspired by that interview because I thought that was really cool. Mm-hmm. And is there anything I would use in the next one? I'm trying to think. I'll have to come back to that because I think I did use a lot of it. Mm-hmm. I'll think on that one.
That dress code is so fascinating that you would actually get tickets for not wearing the right thing.
It's hysterical.
Yeah, so interesting. All right. What is an author that you have always wanted to meet? A question for the both of you.
Ooh, Jamie, you go first. I feel like I'm talking so much.
Well, living author would definitely be Margaret Atwood, because I've been reading her since I was in high school, which I know really dates me, but I mean, I thought she was amazing back when she wrote this book called The Edible Woman, like way before even The Handmaid's Tale. But then, like, for someone who's not alive, like, I wish so much I could meet Judith Krantz and Jackie Collins, who I was reading when I was like young, and they opened my eyes to a lot of things that probably shouldn't have been open to, but I will be forever grateful. It's quite an education.
It's true. It's funny because as writers, we can all think back to books that made us want to be writers, right? Even when I was really little, like, Where the Red Fern Grows or The Bridge to Terabithia, those books where I read them in middle grade. I couldn't tell you right now off the top of my head who the writer was, but like they really changed my ideas about writing because it was the first time where I read something and felt something, right? Like I felt like I could cry or I was crying. And suddenly you're thinking, wow, I want to do that. I want to replicate that and make someone feel something really powerful. For me, I have to say, living author is Beatrice Williams. I read her book, 100 Summers, whenever that came out, I think in the 2000s at some point. And I remember, so that book takes place in Newport right before the crash of the stock market crash of 1929. And I remember putting that book down and saying, this is the kind of book I want to write. I loved it. Everything about it spoke to me. The money, the class issues, the losing, everybody lost everything overnight. And it really stayed with me all of these years. And it's one of the reasons why I write historical fiction. Fiona Davis is another one, The Dollhouse. I remember reading that book and thinking, wow, like you can do this. You can go back in time and tell a really amazing story about a woman and really make someone feel something, but still transport them back in time and teach them about the time period. And that really, really appealed to me. Dead, no one's coming to mind, but I know there's probably 100 and I'm just not thinking of them.
If anything comes up, you can always add to that answer.
Yeah.
All right, our next one. What character was the easiest for you to get into the head of? What character was the most fun to develop? Did you use influences or experiences from your own life in the development of characters?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, I'll go first, Jamie, but I want to hear your answer to this too, because I'm very interested. So I think that writing Everly was the most fun, and she's my main character. I mean, look, as a writer, you have to love your main character or why you're writing your book, right? So I loved her. I love this idea that she was this poor little rich girl, right? She had everything, and yet she didn't have anything she wanted. That just really appealed to me because I've known people like that in my life. I've known people who seem to have everything, but they still don't have what they want. And watching a character realize what she wants and then feel empowered to go after it, to write that arc was just great, great fun. Along the way, I mentioned earlier, there's the character in my book named Starling. And in the beginning of my book, I say, in my dedication, I say, may we all have a Starling in our lives. And Starling, what I mean by that is she was somebody who was a mentor to Everly. She was a strong, powerful woman living completely differently at a time when women didn't live. She's a photographer living on her own. She leaves it's really tragic, but she leaves her husband and child behind to, follow her passion for photography and follow her career. And, that was really, really inspired by a woman who mentored me in college named Georgia Sorensen, who, we just developed this very close relationship. She took me under her wing. She said to me, what are your dreams? Can I help you achieve them? I mean, when I say that, she didn't say those exact things. I'm just trying to sum it up for you guys. But she was somebody who saw something in me as a young woman and decided she was going to help me cultivate that. And, that relationship always has meant so much to me because she really did help me find my way. And so that part of my life really is reflected in that you give a little bit to someone and you take a little bit to someone relationship that Starling and Everly developed. What about you, Jamie?
I always like writing my oldest female characters, like women in their 70s and 80s, because I always imagine they have so much wisdom, like they've lived so much, they have so much experience to speak of. they've earned the right to be like a little bit cantankerous. Like I always feel the pressure for my heroine to be likable, but if I have another character in the book who's like older and wiser, she can be a little bit nasty sometimes, kind of like the way Maggie Smith was able to be in Downton Abbey.
Yeah.
So that to me is like my favorite thing to write, because I don't feel as constrained as I am with the heroine who's got to carry the main story.
Yeah, I love that. I totally agree with that. And that's kind of what Starling is in my book too, right? She's able to just kind of live the way she wants unapologetically. And you can have so much fun with those characters.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question. Without spoiling the story, can you tell us if there were surprises by events and or characters that changed the trajectory of your storyline?
Let me think there. Okay, so one of the things that's coming to mind right now, I don't think I'm going to answer it totally directly, but when this book went to my editor, it came in and she loved it. You know, obviously she published it, but she did say, you need to cut 20,000 words. This book is too long. It needs to be tighter. The narrative, you know, there's places where you're doing one thing in a chapter and you need to be doing 5 things in a chapter. Story-wise, development-wise of the story. You know, there's got to be a little bit of the character arc, a little bit of the mystery of the fire. You know, it's got to have multiple things have to happen in each chapter to keep it interesting. Well, cutting 20,000 words from a book is not easy, as Jamie can tell you. But I went in and I did the first, you know, trick writers have, which is that you cut one sentence from every page. That's like where you start. But then I started synthesizing chapters and combining things and moving parts of the story that showed up earlier. I also cut out, there was more of the love story between, so Everly has her fiance, but then things are going a little south with him and she meets this other young doctor who she develops an interest in. Well, in earlier drafts, you know, he doesn't really come into the book in a real way until midway. In earlier drafts, he came in earlier and the romance was really a distraction. So I cut a lot of that out because really in the end, I wanted it to be a story of Everly's growth and development as a woman, and like that finding of her voice. But having a man be the one to help her get there kind of was working against what I was trying to do. So he became a fun side story, but he wasn't really a part of the main story. But to be honest with you, cutting those 20,000 words, as hard as it was the best thing I ever did because the book reads so much better for it. There were, you know, as a writer, there are moments of reckoning where you just have to sit down and do the work like that. And, you know, in the end, you get a better book. So.
Okay. That's so interesting because, you know, I was thinking, I've been rereading a lot of books from like the 80s and 90s, and they were like 3 times as long as the books we're writing now. And it's really just a matter of the taste of the market at the time. So like if you were writing your book in the 80s, you probably could have told the plus 20,000 word version. True. It's so subjective, like what is good storytelling? And we just happen to be in a time when it's like, they want things like moving very tight. But if you look at like the summer books from like Anne Rivers Siddons, like Outer Banks or any of those, I mean, they're sprawling. And when I read them, I'd be like, okay, that would have been cut. That would have been cut. This whole scene could go. Like they wouldn't have been published like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so funny. I mean, look, we all have such short attention spans, and the younger people in their 20s. I mean, you know, Jamie, from your daughters, but I feel like, you know, they have trouble sitting still and watching a movie without looking at their phones, right? Yeah. So you know, you're right. We do have to write faster and smarter and constantly be getting the attention span back of our readers so that they don't sway and pick up their phone and get distracted.
Yeah.
All right. Our next one is a little bit different, but I think it's a fun one. What is your favorite summer cocktail? Either alcoholic, non-alcoholic, whatever your go-to summer drink is.
Well, I have to say I love rosé. And I'm just going to give a shout out to the Hamptons Wolfler because, you know, I love the summer in the bottle. I drink it all summer long, and North Fork Rosé too at Croteau is amazing. But, you know, it's funny because I write in this time period, I always want to love so many of the cocktails, and there's so many funny ones like the Grasshopper, which was bright green with like vermouth. Oh, it's just, there's so many terrible ones. But in the end, I think a is it like a gin lime Ricky? It's kind of like a gin and tonic, but they add so much lime juice and it's so summery and it's so fun to drink. So that's definitely the one I'll go to if I'm not drinking rosé, but I have to say I'm a rosé girl. What about you, Jamie? What's your drink?
I can't even believe you said that, because literally Wolfer Rosé Summer in a Bottle was my whole inspiration behind blush. I saw that on a menu and I'm like, Summer in a Bottle, that's a book.
Yeah.
And that is how I started writing blush. So I feel like we have so much to talk about.
Oh my God.
When we're not on this camera, but that's my pick as well.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
All right. So our next question, did you have any input with the cover of your book, and were there multiple before these that you had passed on, or was this the first one that you chose?
Okay, this is such a good question. I'm so glad someone asked this, because so I absolutely love my publisher Gallery, because with my first book, they did the same thing. Yeah, thanks, Jamie. They did actually give me a say, but with this cover, it was even more interesting than with the first one, where they really only gave me the choice of the color of her bathing suit. So they let me pick, did I want red or aubergine or green or blue? And we went with red. But with this one, the design director sent my editor and my agent and I about 15 different possibilities, and they were all really different, different colors, either a close-up of a face. One was of a woman wearing like a Peter Pan blouse tucked into a skirt, standing at the beach holding this like adorable little suitcase. It felt a little more like early 50s, 40s almost, so we didn't go with that one. But anyway, what was so interesting is seeing all these covers side by side all together. All of us immediately picked this cover. We were like, we like number 10. We like number 10. And it was all this cover. So we were just immediately drawn to that image. And I thank you, Jamie. And
so pretty. I just like. But was this gold added later, or was that part of your
so
design?
The gold was added later by my publisher, because she felt like the first version was a little, when it printed in the advanced copy, it printed a little washed out, the sky. It didn't look quite as vibrant as we had planned for it to. So then they added that really awesome gold around the, the border and also the words. But yeah, it was pretty fascinating to me that all of us honed in. But I think it's just, they lucked out. I've heard from the design, group that it's hard actually to find an image anymore, because there's so many historical fiction books that it can be hard to find an image that hasn't already been used, that's attractive, that's the time period. You're choosing from a smaller set of photos. But yeah, they really hit it. I love that photo so much.
Wow, that's super interesting about the limited photo stock as more and more historicals. That's fascinating.
Yep, I know. And actually, Summer Darlings, for a long time, I thought that cover of that, I wish I had the book handy. I don't, but I thought the cover of that book was taken back in the 60s, but actually it was posed. It was taken in contemporary times by a photographer in England who posed a woman in a vintage outfit, a vintage bathing suit, and had it in stock. So it actually, the woman is alive. I was like, oh my God, this isn't a vintage. Yeah. So it's interesting, because we can even reach into those pictures now. But no, this one obviously is from the past. It's so beautiful. I'm so proud of the cover. I really am.
Okay, so kind of a similar question, but based on the title. Was there another title before it was On Gin Lane? If so, what was it and how did it change?
Okay, so the title before was One Gin Lane, which isn't that far off. That's the title that I turned it in with. And there was a point where it just occurred to me that someone lives at One Gin Lane in Southampton, and it didn't feel like it was a good idea to put their address on the cover of a book, and it was pretty easy to change it to On Gin Lane. At first I kind of thought, oh, I miss One Gin Lane, I really love it. But I have to say, as time has gone on, I think On Gin Lane is the sexier name. I think it gives you more of a reason to wonder what's going on there versus just the address of one house. So I think it worked out in the end. But Jamie, I actually am very curious how your book title Guilt came about, because it's such a, to me, not to use the word sexy too many times, but it is such a sexy title. Did you come up with that one?
I did. And I'm not even kidding. There's like this is such an unsexy way of how creativity works. I was literally stressed out and I went to get one of those like chair massages at a nail salon. And when I was totally zoned out, the title came to me, like not even trying. And of course, when you're really, really trying, it's like banging your head against the wall. I'll never forget that moment though, because it was the easiest a title to ever come to me.
That's so interesting.
So guilt, it's spelled G-I-L-T, but it's like, so for everyone, it could be something that's got guilt, like a guilt framed photo, but also plays on the emotion guilt. So it like works both ways.
It's so interesting though, because as writers, like, where do these things come from, right? It like popped in your head and it's like, here you are, like, you're probably coming up with like gilded or like all these words.
Oh my gosh, that was like the one freebie from the universe. The rest have not been that easy, but that was it. So thank you, universe.
No, it's great. And the cover's great. If you can kind of see it behind Jamie, it's in the window. It kind of matches her shirt. It's like green.
This is my arc. Here's
Yay!
my arc.
Yeah, I love that cover with the pink and the green.
Yes, we're very dependent on these art departments.
Yes.
They do very important work.
Yes. And this book is different for you, right? Because it doesn't take place at the beach, does it?
It does actually. It takes place in Provincetown.
Oh, and, parts of it. That's right.
Yeah, and I spent the summer living there while I wrote it, which was a unique experience because usually I was living in New York and just visiting places. But that summer 2020, I got to live there because nothing was happening anywhere else in the planet. So that was a unique writing experience.
That's awesome. So you were able to kind of like get to know the area and reveal more of it in the book. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, exactly. Although I've told people, I've always had this fantasy of living, in the place that I'm writing while I'm writing it. And I'm sure you wish you could like transport yourself back in time occasionally, but it actually made things harder because when you're immersed in it, you don't have the remove to like hold up a mirror for your readers. So it was like it was harder for me than when I wrote like from a remove in New York City.
Oh, interesting.
It was an interesting creative experience.
Yeah. I was on the North Fork of Long Island, which is where we have a house closer to kind of where I grew up on the North Shore too. And I would go pick up, I was kind of, I can't remember if I was revising or writing. I must have been, doing a little bit of both, but I would go every day to pick up my daughter at camp. And I would take this back road to go to this like barn where she was going to camp. And the whole back road is cauliflower and different potato. I think there's some potato, but honestly, I think it's mostly cauliflower fields now. And but there was really just dirt. There was nothing growing yet. And in the middle of that field, kind of toward the closer to the road, there was this little empty shack that was white plank that was kind of had no real windows. It was just a place for the workers to go in and cool down a little bit when they were out working in the fields. And when I'm really deep into writing, I see my characters everywhere. I just start seeing them all around me. It's just how the ideas come, and I hear their voices. So I was driving down the road and I was playing some song and I just saw my main character and this love interest of hers, Curtis, kind of running through this field that I was imagining being like a potato field and then going into this, rustic shack and just like kissing. It just like randomly came to me. And it was such a cool moment because it completely ended up in the book and it's from the North Fork. It's not from the Hamptons per se, but same area. Right. But it was just so magical. I love when that happens. And that often happens to me when I'm in the place. So it's a little, similar, but different. I feel like I get so many ideas in summer when I'm living in the place that I write about, and I end up bringing them with me into the winter. When we're freezing and watching the snowfall, but we're still living in summer in our book.
Yeah.
All right. So we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank both Brooke and Jamie so much for being here tonight. Of course, don't forget to purchase a copy of Anjin Lane. We have links in the chat, so you can easily click on those. You can come visit us in store. We also have links to pre-order Guilt in the chat, so make sure you do that as well. We will contact the winner of the raffle once we choose the winner. So thank you all for submitting your questions, and thank you all for being here tonight. Again, thank you so much to Brooke and Jamie.
Thanks you so much, Jamie. You're amazing.
Happy Pub Day, Brooke.
Thank you.